So I know this has been quite a lot of material this week, but I promise this is the last video with material for you this week. So we need to talk, when we talk about genetics, we need to talk about pedigrees. And pedigrees are really just like a family tree, a way to see how different traits are inherited within different families. So within this, we typically will have squares representing males, circles representing females. We'll have horizontal lines connecting a male and female. This is going to represent a mating. And vertical lines that extend downwards are going to represent their children. So in this particular case, you had a woman and a man. They had one child, they had a daughter. Okay, and then her and another man had 1, 2, 3 children. They had 1, 2 boys and 1 girl. Out of those children, this boy had 2 children, this daughter had 1 son, and then this son had 3 children. So we typically will find the oldest individuals at the top of the pedigree. In this case, this would be the great-grandparents, these would be the grandmother, these would be the father and mother and the aunts and uncles, and then these would be the children and the cousins. So it's customary to shade in the symbol of all individuals that happen to possess whatever trait that we're talking about. So here from your book, there's a few others terms that are not quite as standard, but you may also see. So again, we talked about the female, the male. If there's sex unknown, maybe the child died too early or there was some other issue, we'll represent that as a diamond. Affected individuals will again be shaded in. Parents, assuming they're unrelated, are going to have just one single line connecting them. Related parents, in the case of maybe cousins, first cousins marrying one another or so on, are going to be represented as 2 lines across. We do typically will represent the offspring in their birth order. We'll give them numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. In the case of fraternal twins, sex may be the same, they may be different. In this case, you saw a line that this came from the same event, but there were 2 different children. If they're identical twins, the sex must be the same because they're identical twins. In this case, we draw this extra little line across the top. Let's see. In this case, if there's a P pointing to something, we call this a proband. And what this is the individual whose phenotype first brought attention to the family. So the first case where we really started to recognize this as an issue within whatever particular family. A deceased individual you'll indicate with a line through this. In this case, this was a female. A carrier, if we know that they're a carrier, you'll indicate this with a little dot inside the symbol. And you will indicate the different generations with a 1, 2, a 3. These are going to be Roman numerals. So here's some examples. In this case, this is representing an autosomal recessive trait. And you can have this particular individual, must have had that particular case. They had 3 children. Remember, recessive traits are typically going to skip generations, so nobody in this particular generation happened to have it. However, in this 3rd generation, we now have 2 individuals who happen to have this particular trait. We know this is going to be recessive autosomal. We'll talk more about that, what that means. But basically, it means that they're going to appear equally in both sexes. So if something is autosomal, it's going to affect chromosomes 1 to 22, the non-sex chromosomes. If something is going to be sex-linked or X-linked, we'll talk about that. It's going to be inherited via the X chromosome or the Y chromosome. If something is autosomal dominant, dominant traits always are going to appear every generation. So you can see here's an individual with it. This individual had children with it. You'll also tend to see it at about a 50-50 ratio of children that do have it and children that don't have it. So just a quick review of just some of the different types of inheritance. If something is autosomal recessive inheritance, it means that it's typically going to skip generations. It's going to affect males and females equally likely. If something is autosomal dominant inheritance, affected individuals are going to have an affected parent. and it's again going to affect males and females equally likely. When we're talking about these things that are autosomes, what we're talking about is any chromosome other than the sex chromosome, so chromosomes 1 through 22. If something is going to be X-linked, it's going to involve the sex chromosomes, so the X and Y chromosomes. And we're going to talk about these later in a later chapter. So a little bit more detail, these autosomal dominant. One dose of this mutant gene, you just need one mutant allele. It's all that's required for expression of the phenotype. So an individual with, say, 2 capital A's, in this case, has the disorder. An individual who has a capital A and lowercase a, who's heterozygous, also will have the disorder, because you only need one copy of that dominant trait to have that phenotype. An individual with 2 lowercase a's, a recessive, does not have the disorder. So a couple of hallmarks of something that's going to be autosomal dominant inheritance. Again, each affected individual is going to have an affected parent, and there is no skipping of generations. Males and females equally likely to be affected. About 1/2 of the offspring of an affected individual are going to be affected, and normal siblings of affected individuals all will have normal offspring. So an example of a tree like this, you can see here, and we can actually calculate from this what are the genotypes of all people whose genotypes are known. So I'm going to let you pause it here. I've circled here every individual that has the disorder. We know that they must be heterozygous, capital A, lowercase a. Everyone else in this case, because they do not have the disorder, they must be a homozygous. It is very rare to have someone who's homozygous dominant for these particular traits. And in this case, really the only way that that could happen is if you have 2 affected individuals having a child together. If something is autosomal recessive, it means the person who has 2 lowercase 1 traits or 2 recessive copies, you need 2 copies of this abnormal gene to be present in order for this disease or trait to develop. So in this case, an individual with the capital A does not have the disorder. An individual with capital A lowercase a also does not have the disorder. But in this case, they're going to be a carrier of the particular trait. And an individual with lowercase a does indeed have the disorder. So this is an example of an autosomal recessive tree. This is an example of a family that has albinoism. It happens to be inherited as an autosomal recessive trait. So there's a couple of interesting things you're going to note about this tree. In this case, you can see these 2 individuals are first cousins that have children together. Here's another example of some first cousins that have children together. Now I'll let you pause it and try to determine what are the genotypes of all people whose genotypes might be known. Okay, so in this case we know that every individual who is affected must be, in this case, lowercase a. Because they have the disorder, they must have 2 recessive copies of that allele. We also can go back and calculate who were their parents. How must this trait have been inherited? So you can go back, these affected individuals, you know that their parents must both have been carriers for this particular trait. In this case here as well, you know that both parents must have been carriers in order to have a child with this particular trait. When you look back, because they are cousins, you know that they must have been inherited with the people who are directly related in the family, not somebody who had married in. So you can say that this woman here, that it must have been inherited through her mother. This man here, it must have been inherited through his mother. Same with this woman here. And then this man here must have inherited from his father. You cannot say at this point which of these grandparents was the carrier. All you can say is that it must have been inherited at this particular generation. So just again, some differences if you're looking at pedigrees between the dominant and the recessive. These autosomal dominant disorders tend to occur every generation of an affected family, and every affected person usually is going to have an affected parent. The autosomal recessive disorders not typically seen in every generation of affected families. And in fact, it can skip a number of generations before this trait might reveal itself. All you can say is that an affected individual has to have two unaffected parents who each carry a copy of the mutated gene, and they're going to be referred to as carriers. And so a lot of genetic testing, a lot of prenatal testing will focus on the woman. They will look to see whether or not she's a carrier for any particular type of disorder. If she is, then they will often bring in her partner to test him as well, and they will see if he was also a carrier for a particular trait. Then those children likely will have a 25% chance or a 1 in 4 chance of having children with that trait. Now, if the woman's not a carrier, they often will not bother testing the male, because the worst that can happen is that they have children who are a carrier for that particular trait. Okay, so this is the end of week 2. Make sure that you go and you check out the homework on the Mastering Genetics website. If you have trouble logging into this website or accessing my instructor page on the website, please contact me. My page is linked on the syllabus, so go back to the syllabus and you can look at my instructor code from that. Also, please make sure that you're participating in the discussion forums. They've been a little quiet lately, so please just make sure that you are looking at the topics. You don't have to answer every single topic, but make sure that you answer at least a few of the topics, at least once per week or so.